Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. Dr. Elias Thorne didn't need the calendar on the auxiliary wall monitor to know it was September. The air in the central processing hub of Station K Fushirsu, a pressurized, humming steel sarcophagus buried beneath the shifting ice of the Barrens. Sea smelled like stale ozone, burnt coffee, and the impending months, Jan-long doom of Arctic night. He only ever smelled that specific, anxiety, Jan-inducing cocktail when the last supply run had departed, leaving the 6 members of K Fushisi to their winter sentence. Elias ran a hand over his tired face. The stubble felt like iron filings. He was the chief xenobiologist, which meant he spent most of his time monitoring the deep Jan-sea autonomous probes and trying to justify their existence to a government agency that fundamentally misunderstood the term deep Jan-sea. The real work, the reason they were all there, was something the grant paperwork called pre-Jan Cambrian litho Jan acoustics, a grand phrase for listening to the world crack and groan under the weight of geological time. Anything from dagger, Elias murmured, addressing the empty air, which promptly responded with the clear, slightly mechanical voice of the station's AI, designated Helm. Acoustic probe dagger remains responsive. It is currently at E1 E10 by me eaters. Data integrity is nominal. It is transmitting standard seismic noise, Dr. Thorne. Nothing new, nothing noteworthy. Helm replied. Define nominal. Helm, Elias pressed, already knowing the answer. Nominal means the background cacophony of deep Jan-sea pressure fractures and hydrothermal vent activity remains consistent with observations over the last Shubha an average of Iwan Sitien Babayundi, crow Jan tremors per hour. Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. The problem wasn't what was nominal, the problem was what wasn't. For the past 3 weeks, the data feeds had been haunted by a pervasive, low Jan frequency hum. It wasn't seismic, it wasn't magnetic, and it certainly wasn't biological. It was a perfect, unwavering Tsidamba Uch tone, a sub-Jan oral frequency known to cause feelings of anxiety, dread, and occasionally nausea. In humans, the kind of sound your body felt more than your ears registered. The other 5 crew members, geophysicist Zara, engineer Dmitri, mechanic Ben, chef-o-medic Anya, and station commander Reyes, had all dismissed it as noise pollution, a glitch in the new power converter, or maybe a resonance issue with the drilling rig they'd abandoned last spring. But Elias knew the truth. He had spent his life listening to silence, and this tone was far too deliberate to be accidental. It was structured like the slow, deep breath of something impossibly massive. He opened a new terminal and pulled up the raw audio feed from Dagger. He routed it through his specialized isolating headphones, bypassing the internal speaker system. The moment the sound hit, the familiar metallic taste of fear bloomed in his mouth. Brum. It was only a sound, yet it felt like a physical presence, a weight pressing on his chest. He amplified the signal, boosting the tone to the very threshold of auditory discomfort. That's when he saw it in the spectral analysis, a brief, faint spike, lasting less than 100 milliseconds, superimposed on the Tsidamba Huchihu. He zoomed in. The spike wasn't random, it was a pattern. 3 distinct sequential impulses, perfectly spaced, a rhythm. Click, click, Jan, click. No, not a rhythm. A count. 1, 2, 3. Helm, isolate the Tsidamba Hutch carrier wave and cross Jan reference the micro Jan spike pattern, Elias commanded, his voice tight. Executing cross Jan reference query. Estimated time, Sidanba Melsecons. The AI responded. Elias waited, the synthetic hum filling the void in his skull. The station lights, usually a bright, reassuring white, suddenly felt too yellow, too close. He glanced around the processing hub, its curved steel walls reflecting his anxious image like a funhouse mirror. K. Fu Shisu was designed for comfort. But the truth was, it was an oversized tin can floating in a lightless, crushing ocean, separated from oblivion by a few inches of welded metal. The computer screen flashed. Query complete. The pattern identified as an impulse triplet occurred each and down by Basha times in the last Tisha hours. It began precisely at Lindian UTC on August Arshiju TH immediately. Following the deployment of probe dagger into the Hadal zone rift 1,280 times, Elias whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. That meant it was repeating every 3 minutes and Arsha Armel's econs with unnerving precision. It wasn't a glitch, it was communication, or at least iteration. He thought of the sheer scale. Dagger was kilometers down, sitting on the edge of a rift that, according to Zara's recent seismic scans, plunged into a geological anomaly, unlike anything they had charted. A perfectly spherical void beneath the Earth's crust. Helm, cross-stand reference, the impulse triplet with known acoustic libraries. Biological, human, tectonic, military everything, Elias instructed. Searching, query results. Lean M atches found. No known source matches the signature of the impulse triplet. Furthermore, based on signal degradation and propagation velocity, the source of the Tidernba Hoji carrier wave is estimated to originate from a point approximately 6 kilometers below the probe's current depth, 40 kilometers below the seabed, deeper than anything they could reasonably measure, deeper than any known life could sustain, and far deeper than the limits of human knowledge. Elias stared at the screen, the 3 faint spikes on the waveform, suddenly screaming a silent message that shattered his scientific composure. It was tapping, something deep in the void of the Earth, underneath kilometers of ocean, and another 6 kilometers of solid rock was counting, and it had noticed Dagger. Just as the implication of that thought fully crystallized, the understanding that a geological anomaly was not a void, but a chamber, the lights in the hub flickered violently. The humming of the systems around him changed pitch, an audible groan replacing the smooth whir. Helm, report power status, Elias yelled. External power feed compromised. Station K Fushisu Gongjin S automatically switched to auxiliary battery power. Estimated power duration, 96小时, hours. The cause of the failure is a rapid, localized pressure spike registered at the Dagger probe's telemetry housing. Warning, Dagger's signal is failing. Elias snatched the mic, his heart hammering against his ribs. Dagger confirm visual feed. Report environmental status. What's happening down there? Only static answered. But through the screeching white noise of the failing signal, the deep, persistent Tidanbahut's hum didn't waver. And then, cutting through the noise with chilling clarity, came the impulse triplet again. Click, 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 Jan click. But this time, it wasn't distant. This time, it sounded like it was right outside the hull. And this time, it was followed by a ragged, wet sound, like tearing canvas, that definitely didn't belong to any known acoustic library. Dr. Thorne, Helm's voice was suddenly stripped of its mechanical calmness, laced with a raw electronic tremor. A new reading has been detected. The source of the impulse triplet is no longer 6 kilometers below the rift. It is currently moving toward the station at an unprecedented rate of Ibai Wushimi meters per second. Collision with the station hull is imminent. Time until impact, send an mouse econs. The end of the countdown was not a violent, shattering explosion, but something far worse. A sickening, bones and deep thud, followed by a drawn out, resonant groan. It was the sound of millions of tons of steel and pressure, Jan-rated composite screaming in protest. A sound Elias Thorne instantly understood as the station hall yielding. In the processing hub, the bright lights died with a snap. The silence that followed was not quiet, but deafening. A void filled by the shriek of grinding metal and the roar of compressed water, finding a path where none should exist. Elias was thrown against his console, the force of the impact, kinetic, not concussive. It felt less like a crash and more like an impossibly heavy object had simply leaned on them. Emergency power kicked in, bathing the control room in a pulsing, angry red light that emphasized the sharp edges of panic. The air immediately smelled different, metallic and cold. The scent of crushed, deep Jansi sediment, suddenly present inside the sealed environment. Elias ripped off his headphones, his ears ringing, and scrambled through the narrow doorway into the main corridor, where the lights strobed violently. He needed to find Commander Reyes. The commander was already in the central command module, hunched over his primary display, his military training wrestling with the surreal terror of the situation. Reyes was a man built of granite and procedure, but the tremor in his voice when he spoke into the comms betrayed the geological impossibility of what had just happened. Dmitri, Ben, report status in engineering. Anya, check the air seals on the galley. Geophysicist Zara, where are you? Reyes barked, slamming his fist onto the comms activation pad. Commander, I'm in the observation dome corridor. Structural integrity nominal here, but the bulkheads are singing. Sarah's voice crackled, high and strained. The external hydrophone array went dead 2 seconds before impact. I'm getting massive acoustic interference. It's like trying to listen through a bag of gravel. Engineering is on aux power, Commander. It was Dmitri, the engineer, his Russian accent thick with adrenaline. We have a critical pressure drop in Section C, the old drill Jan head docking bay. The automated blast door sealed, but the pressure differential is unstable. The door is compromised. We need to get eyes on the seal and cycle the emergency pressure compensators before the door fails completely. Section C, that was the forward Jan-most point of the station. The original borehole access, long since capped and sealed with a multi-Jan-ton blast door and an external shroud. It was also the closest point to the deployment path of Probe Dagger. Elias stumbled into the command module, his hands still shaking. He didn't bother with protocol. Commander, it wasn't debris. It was a directed vector. Helm recorded the source moving from 40 Jan 2 kilometers below the seabed at 150 meters a second. Elias yelled, gesturing frantically back toward the dark processing hub. It's impossible. No known mass, no technology could achieve that speed and stop that fast. It tapped the probe, and then it hit us. Reyes turned, his face pale beneath the red strobes. His eyes locked on Elias. Thorne, I don't care about your theories right now. There's something tearing through the hull. I need damage assessment, not physics speculation. But it's connected, Elias insisted, desperation making his voice crack. The same impulse triplet, the same T-Ba H the carrier wave. The impact was the triplet. Commander, click, 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 Jan, click. It used the same signature to make physical contact. Just then, a faint, rhythmic vibration pulsed up through the deck plates beneath their feet. It was a subtle, shuddering pattern, easily missed beneath the general chaos of the station's groaning. Reyes stopped, his breath hitching. He wasn't Elias, trained to listen to the void, but he was a man who understood vibration in a metallic structure. This wasn't random stress. It was deliberate, brum. The low Jan frequency carrier wave had returned, not through speakers, but through the structure itself, vibrating the very bones of the station. Then came the telltale pressure of the count. Thump, 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 Jan thump. The floor beneath them shivered 3 times, a perfectly timed beat that resonated deep in the chest. The final thump, Jan thump, lingering like a cold echo. It felt less like being struck and more like being prodded. What in God's name is that? Reyes whispered, finally hearing the sound that had tormented Elias for weeks. It's not debris, Commander. It's what hit us, and it's still out there. It's making contact with the hull, Elias explained, his voice hushed with the profound, terrifying realization. It's listening to the reaction. Reyes snapped back into action, his military reflexes taking over. Did Mitri, Ben, forget the compensators? Get to Section C, manually depressurize the chamber beyond the blast door, and inspect the locking mechanism. Use the thermal cutter if you have to. Seal that breach now? Affirmative, Commander. On our way, Dmitri confirmed, his voice slightly more composed now that he had a task. Elias knew the drill gen head docking bay was an airlock designed to handle tools, not people, and certainly not the full pressure of the Hadal zone. The internal volume was small, less than 4 cubic meters, barely enough room for 2 men to maneuver. If the door failed, the entire station would be compromised in seconds. He rushed over to Reyes's console, his scientist's mind ignoring the pressure of the moment, seeking only data. He pulled up the external visual feed from the only remaining functioning camera, an infrared unit mounted high on the station's main tower, designed to monitor surface ice flows. The video was distorted by the water, but it was enough. Commander, look at this. The pressure spike that took out the external power. It registered at the old drilling shroud, not the main hull. Elias zoomed in on the dark, grainy image. It didn't hit the station, Reyes. It hit the shroud, the hollow sleeve running up to the ice sheet. That ragged sound Helm registered was the shroud tearing off its moorings. So, what does that mean, Thorne? Reyes demanded, his eyes fixed on the critical pressure gauge for Section C, which was slowly, implacably climbing. It means whatever this thing is, it's smart or methodical. It didn't slam into our main pressure hull. It impacted the weakest, thinnest piece of structure attached to the station, disabling our external power and communications in one precise movement, Elias said, swallowing hard. It was a probe. It used the shroud as a feeler, a point of contact to check our structural integrity. Before Reyes could respond, a new alarm blared, a thin, reedy sound that cut through the deep groaning of the steel. Warning, interior atmospheric composition change detected. Trace amounts of high Xan concentration sulfur, methane, and an unidentifiable, heavier Xan than Xan air gas detected in Section C. Recommend immediate atmospheric filtration and lockdown of adjacent sections, Helm announced, its synthetic voice recovering some of its composure. Reyes swore, a low, savage curse. Dmitri, Ben, stop. Do not enter Section C. Repeat. Do not open that access hatch. The chamber is compromised, but the damage was already done. The thing outside hadn't just hit the station, it had left something behind, something that was now seeping into the thin, fragile air they breathed. The chemical signature of the deep, black void was now inside K Fuchsia C, and the rhythmic thump, thump, gen thump continued, now accompanied by a faint, wet, scraping sound, like a heavy, blunt object being dragged across the outside of the titanium hull, directly over the compromised Section C. It was no longer tapping for a response. It was working. Anya Petrova, the station's chef and medic, didn't panic. Panic was a waste of oxygen, and K. Fushirsu was suddenly in short supply of things that couldn't be replaced. She was already in the medical bay, a small, brightly lit module tucked behind the galley, running the atmospheric analysis data that Helm had flagged from Section C. The trace gases methane and hydrogen sulfide were expected byproducts of deep sea lithothermal activity. But the third component, the unidentifiable, heavier than Zan air gas, designated simply Compound X, was an enigma. Anya adjusted her headset, her attention fixed on the spectrometry readout. The software's database simply returned error, zero match probability, over and over. She looked at the raw elemental breakdown, incredibly dense molecules dominated by silicon, phosphorus, and complex carbon chains, but arranged in a geometry she had never encountered, highly organized, almost crystalline structures that shouldn't exist in a gas phase. Anya, what is the threat level for Compound X? Commander Reyes's voice crackled over the comms, tense and demanding. Enya wiped a bead of sweat from her temple. Commander, I can't classify it. The molecular density is too high for a natural gas, but the phase is wrong. It acts like an organic vapor, but its components are purely geological. It is heavier than air, which means it's pooling on the floor of Section C. If that hatch opens, it will flood the entire forward segment of the station. Can we filter it? Our standard scrubbers will handle the methane and sulfur, but Compound X won't even register on the primary filters. It might clog them completely. We need to lock down sections B and D immediately and prepare the emergency air packs, Anya ordered, her medical training overriding her civilian fear. Just as she finished the sentence, the low, resonant brum from the hull intensified, and the floor plates shuddered with another thump. Thump and thump. This time, the final two pulses were drawn out, accompanied by a hideous metallic whine. It wasn't scraping anymore. It was grinding. It's using the hull resonance to transmit the carrier wave. Elias's voice cut in, strained. Enya, can you analyze the gas for biological markers? Is there any enzymatic activity? Anything that suggests the life form is breathing it? Anya started the biogen assay. Minutes dragged by, marked only by the escalating metallic torture from Section C. Dimitri and Ben were standing by in the central junction, their hands hovering over the internal blast door controls, waiting for Reyes's order to abandon the forward section entirely. Meanwhile, 2 compartments away in the observation dome corridor, Zara Vasilieva was alone, surrounded by inactive sensor arrays and the huge curved window that normally provided a terrifyingly beautiful view of the lightless abyss. Now, the window showed only blackness, occasionally catching the angry red strobe lights from the corridor. Zara, the geophysicist, felt a terrible calm settle over her. She knew fear, but her mind worked best when faced with impossible numbers. Elias had given them the vector, Ibaiwushimi etors per second. The force of the impact was what she needed. She pulled up the compromised seismic data from the moment the drilling shroud was struck. She ran the collision data through a rapid force Jan mass calculation model, comparing the deformation of the shredded titanium shroud with the measured kinetic energy transfer. Helm, run the inverse equation for the impact event at Sender Safin hours, Zara commanded, her voice low. Input total kinetic energy measured against the shroud deformation factor. Output mass estimation of the impacting object, assuming a solid state. Executing inverse equation. Mass calculation factor returned. Badiangio, unilion metric tons, based on an assumed velocity of Ibaiwushimi eters per second. Zara stared at the screen. A solid object weighing Badiangio unilion metric tons, more than 5 times the mass of the Eiffel Tower, Moving at Ibai meters per second would not have merely caused a thud. It would have annihilated the station. Reyes, Elias, listen up, Zara called over the comms, her voice deadly serious. My initial calculation is impossible. If the entity was a solid object moving at that speed, K Fu Shisu would be a sheet of aluminum foil right now. But the force was applied. It means one of two things. Either the entity decelerated from Meimao Ibai Wushimi to near Jan Zero in a fraction of a millisecond, defying all known inertial laws, or she ran a different simulation, an object with vastly different physical properties, one that wasn't solid, but whose mass was distributed dynamically. Or what? Zara, spit it out, Reyes demanded, or its density is variable. Zara concluded, the words feeling alien on her tongue. It has a negligible density for 99.9% of its volume, but can condense its mass into localized, multi-Zanton points of contact. I've never seen anything like it. It is like a cloud that can hit like a meteor. She adjusted her seismic filters, trying to capture the subtle vibrations of the thing that was working on the hull outside Section C. The rhythmic thump, thump, jan thump was constant, a low jan frequency hammer against the metal. But between the pulses, she detected something else. Thousands of tiny, rapid clicks, like microscopic grit being driven against the metal. Zara filtered the clicks and boosted the audio. What came out was a horrifying high-jan speed chatter too fast for human hearing, like 1,000 insects scratching the surface of the station. It was the sound of millions of individual points of contact. Reyes, I have a new analysis of the external scraping, Zara whispered, the terror finally breaking through her calm facade. It's not one blunt object. It is countless small points applying incredible, localized pressure. It is not trying to tear the door off, Commander. It is trying to drill through the seal material, inch by inch, with focused, repetitive micro-Jan impacts. Back in the med bay, the bio-Jan assay for compound X completed with a loud, chiming alarm. Warning, biological activity detected in compound X. High concentration of cellular Jan-level structures present, Helm reported. Anya stared at the magnified image on the screen. The gas wasn't a gas. It was a dense swarm of microscopic, Rodzan-like organisms, each one constructed of the same high Zan density silicon and phosphorus components. They weren't moving randomly. They were moving together, forming slow, viscous currents within the airlock. Reyes, the gas is biological, a cloud of highly organized microorganisms, and Elias, Anya said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. They are using the methane and sulfur as a nutrient base. They are actively feeding and reproducing inside Section C, and their waste product is this compound X. It is not a toxic gas. It's a self-Jan replicating silicon-Jan-based organic swarm. As the full terror of the internal biological contamination registered, Dimitri's voice erupted over the comms, no longer composed, but a raw, terrified shriek. Commander, the scraping stopped. It stopped, but the inner blast door, it's bowing. We're getting liquid seepage. Then, a sudden, wet pop echoed through the station's internal structure. The pressure gauge for Section C, which had been slowly climbing, snapped the other way, plummeting to zero. Warning, internal blast door seal has failed. Section C is compromised. Immediate lockdown of all adjacent corridors initiated. High Zan density, heavier Zanans in air bio, Zan mass detected leaving Section C and entering Corridor D Fuyi. The scraping had stopped because the organism outside was done with the door. The organism inside, the cloud of silicon life, was now free to move. Dmitri, Ben, get out of that corridor now. Reyes screamed, but the response was just a terrible, strangled sound, followed by static, and then a slow, low, unmistakable noise from Corridor D Fuyi. The rhythmic thump, thump, Jan thump. But this time, it was inside the station. That escalates the situation dramatically, introducing both the physical dread of the hyper-Jan dense entity outside and the horrifying, microscopic biological invasion inside. The wet pop that signaled the final catastrophic failure of the inner blast door seal was followed instantly by a guttural, sucking sound, like a giant clearing its throat. Dmitry Volkov didn't even have time to register Reyes's final, frantic warning to retreat. He and Ben, the mechanic, were standing in Junction D, a cramped access point leading directly to the sealed standoff Section C. A dense black plume erupted from the failed seal, not jetting out with pressure, but cascading down. It wasn't vapor, it was too heavy, too deliberate. The initial burst looked like spilled oil, thick and viscous, yet it moved with the fluidity of a heavy gas, seeking the lowest point of the corridor. It had no odor, yet it tasted of sterile, profound cold on the back of Dimitri's throat. Blast door, cycle it, Ben. Now, Dimitri screamed, slapping the emergency lockdown override on the junction panel. Ben's face, already pale under the red strobes, was fixed on the encroaching darkness. He slammed his hand on the internal cycling lever. The massive circular blast door separating Junction D from the rest of the station began its grinding, slow movement. They had only seconds. As the door began to close, the mass that had flooded out of Section C hit the floor of the junction. It was like liquid velvet, an impossible, churning layer of soot that instantly began to pool around their ankles. And then the sound began. Thump, thump, den thump. It wasn't external. It wasn't the station hull, the low, heavy rhythm Elias had identified. The counting was emanating directly from the black, coiling cloud around their feet. It was a pressure wave generated within the biotan mass itself, resonating through the deck plates and straight into Dimitri's nervous system. It felt like his own heartbeat had been hijacked by something vast and malignant. Ben stumbled, gagging. I can't breathe this stuff, Daima. It's like breathing sand. Hold your breath. Get through. Dimitri wrestled with the slow, motorized blast door, trying to force it faster, but it was agonizingly slow, built for stability, not speed. The black mass was now calf-tan deep. Dimitri could see it clearly, not gas particles, but millions upon millions of tiny crystalline organisms glittering faintly in the strobing light. They flowed together, forming undulating, slow-jan moving ropes and currents. As the mass encountered Ben's thick rubber-work boots, it didn't absorb them. It coated them, clinging with an almost magnetic tenacity. Ben tried to pull his foot free, but the effort was useless. The moment the microscopic organisms adhered, they seemed to exert a focused, cumulative pressure. He gave a choked cry as the mass traveled up his leg in a lightning-tan-fast column. It was no longer a cloud. It was a hungry, directed fluid. It's heavy. God, it's so heavy. Ben shrieked, struggling against the sudden, immovable weight that had settled on his limbs. Dimitri watched in paralyzing horror as the black fluid climbed Ben's body. It didn't burn or corrode, it simply covered him, adhering to his clothes, and then his exposed skin. The silicon-Zan-based life was performing that impossible trick Zara had observed, condensing its vast variable mass into localized points of contact. Ben was being immobilized by a dense, suffocating film of organized life. Ben's desperate screams were cut short as the mass covered his mouth and nose, turning his head into a featureless, black dome. His body convulsed once, his arms flailing against the sudden, crushing weight, before the rhythmic thump, thump, jan, thump from the floor plates seemed to absorb his struggles entirely. Dmitri lunged, grabbing Ben's arm, but it was like trying to haul a statue encased in fresh concrete. He had to make a choice. The blast door was closing, now only a meter from sealing shut. With a final, desperate shove, Dmitri threw himself through the shrinking gap, tearing his arm free of Ben's immobilized grip. The heavy click of the final hydraulic seal engaging was the loudest sound in the universe. He collapsed onto the deck of the central corridor just as the thump, thump, Jan thump on the other side of the meter, Jan thick metal wall continued, steady and terrible. It had found its first nutrient source, and it was counting. In the command module, the comms room erupted with static, followed by the terrifying, ragged sound of Ben's final cry, cut short by the sealing of the blast door. Commander Reyes stared at the console, his face etched with disbelief and mounting dread. Report, Dmitri? A few agonizing seconds later, a raw, wheezing voice came over the line. I'm through, Commander. Ben is gone. The door is sealed. The contaminant is not gas. It's heavy. It adheres. It is alive. Elias, pale and shaking, turned to Anya, who was now running blood toxicity tests based on the contaminants. The compound X, it's not a waste product. It's the organism itself. The gas is the mode of entry. It replicates, and when it achieves critical density, it can exert force. It's physical, Anya nodded grimly, and its elemental structure, that high silicon and phosphorus content, it explains the sound. This organism is not carbon-jan based like us. It is solid enough to carry a physical vibration. The thump is its internal function, perhaps its mechanism for cellular division or movement. It's counting because it's growing. Reyes rose from his chair, his hands braced on the console. Helm confirmed Section C and Junction D lockdown. Cycle all atmospheric scrubbers and use a Class Jan E high Jan heat purge on the entire section. Incinerate the organism. Executing Class Jan E purge protocol. However, Dr. Thorne, Dr. Petrova, the current status of the external entity must be addressed based on the new seismic data from Dr. Vasilieva and the continued structural stress in the section adjacent to Junction D. The external mass is adapting. The rhythmic pressure applied to the hull is increasing in magnitude and frequency. Zara's voice, calm and analytical, despite the death of Ben, cut in from the observation dome. Helm is right, Commander. The entity outside is responding to our actions. It is learning the frequency of our defense systems. Every time we seal a door or trigger a purge, the external force increases. It's testing the integrity of the remaining hull. Elias looked at the external schematic. The immense pressure from the outside entity was now focused on a single point right next to the newly sealed Junction D blast door. The internal pressure of the biojan mass, trying to escape the Class Jan E purge, was pushing back from the inside. The thin layer of titanium separating the station's vital core from the crushing abyss was now caught in a terrifying squeeze. Commander, we have to assume the external force and the internal biojan mass are extensions of the same intelligence, Elias declared, his voice hard. It hit us to deploy the swarm. The swarm is designed to replicate, consume, and compromise the seals from the inside, while the parent mass applies the external counter Jan pressure. Reyes looked at the surviving crew members. Elias, the manic scientist, Anya, the steady medic, Zara, the unnerving calculator, and Dmitri, the shell Jan shocked engineer. 5 people left in a can under kilometers of water, facing an adversary that defied physics and biology. We're not waiting for that thing to break through the next wall, Reyes said, his voice flat with resolve. We have Joshua, hours of battery power remaining. We are going to abandon K Fu Shi. Zara, plot a course to the nearest habitable zone on the shelf. Elias, prepare the ROVs for external reconnaissance. We need to know what we're fleeing. Anya pointed to the internal console. Commander, the purge is failing. Compound X density is not dropping. Its cellular structure is resisting the heat. The purge is only making it replicate faster. The internal comms crackled. The heavy resonant sound, now amplified by the metallic structure of the station, seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The thump, and thump, was no longer restricted to Junction D. It was advancing. It was in the main ventilation ducts. The entity had found its way around the blast door. That chapter was brutal, killing off Ben and confirming the organism's terrifying, intelligent nature. The internal threat is now replicating faster due to the failed purge and is spreading through the station's ventilation system. The crew is preparing a desperate evacuation. Zara Vasileva did not experience panic. Fear, for her, was a variable in an equation, an irrational quantity that muddied the necessary calculations. While Dmitri was suffering the acute shock of losing his partner to the impossible black fluid, and Elias was spiraling into the terror of intellectual violation, Zara simply focused on the parameters of survival: escape velocity, hull integrity, and distance. She remained in the observation dome corridor, the red emergency light painting her analytical face in clinical strokes. Her current task, plotting the course to the nearest habitable shelf, required absolute precision. She brought up the station's geological maps, overlaying them with the deep Jansi current and thermal activity readings. The nearest safe zone, a dormant volcanic ridge where the geothermal vents could hold a small mobile station for refueling, was Sipaiwusha kilometers away. Helm, calculate optimal trajectory for Station K Fushusemi, Obo Drive, compensating for a Sishu degree list due to exterior hull distortion at minimum operational speed, Zara commanded, her voice steady. Calculating. Estimated travel time to safety zone. Bashabashosher, hours, Sufenjong. Helm responded. Note, current structural stress exceeds 500 threshold in the D-Gen junction area. Recommended immediate cessation of all hull gen stressing activities, including mobile drive engagement. Acknowledged, Helm. The mobile drive is the only non-gen hull gen stressing activity we have left, Zara muttered, finalizing the coordinates. The evacuation plan hinged entirely on the successful deployment of the ROV, the remotely operated vehicle. They needed visual confirmation of the external entity's shape and, more crucially, its precise point of contact. This information was vital for Reyes to know where to direct the station's meager remaining defense systems during the attempted ascent. The ROV hangar was located 2 corridors down from the central command module, adjacent to the engine maintenance bay. It was a cold, rarely used section, and Zara had to get there alone. Elias was glued to the comms, trying to find a frequency, any frequency that hadn't been choked by the deep, continuous brum of the external entity. Zara grabbed a heavy Jan-duty wrench and a compressed air tank, not for the air, but for the burst of focused cold it could provide, hoping it might slow the silicon organism if she encountered it. She stepped out of the observation dome. The main corridor was eerily quiet, save for the mechanical shuddering of the failed class Jan-E purge in the distance. But now, another sound had become clear, a faint, persistent hissing sound from the ventilation grill near the floor. It was the sound of the compound X evaporating within the pressurized ducts, spreading its microscopic crystalline cells like spores. She moved with an unnerving brisk pace, her rubbers and soled boots making soft thwips on the metal deck. She passed the galley, where Anya was frantically sterilizing all remaining food stores, and headed toward the junction leading to the engine maintenance section. When she reached the turn, the thump, thump, Jan thump was undeniable. It resonated from the main air vent directly overhead, a low, muscular sound that vibrated the fillings in her teeth. It was moving slowly but continuously. It was inside the ductwork. Zara kept moving. The ROV hangar door was a thick, simple manual seal, no electrics to fail. She twisted the locking wheel, the mechanism groaning in protest. As the hatch hissed open, a blast of sterile, freezing air hit her. The hangar was depressurized, isolated from the station atmosphere. It was safe from the internal biodes and mass, but it put her feet from the abyss. The Ravov, nicknamed Scout, was nestled in its launch cradle, a blocky, yellow machine equipped with deep Jan C floodlights, high Jan definition cameras, and a full suite of environmental sensors. Zara quickly activated the hangar's auxiliary power panel, which was running off a separate independent battery pack. She uploaded the external sonar parameters she had developed, a highly complex frequency designed to penetrate the external entity's Brum carrier wave. She mounted the control console and activated the main umbilical connection to Scout. The screen flickered to life, showing a narrow, dark view of the hangar's launch bay. Commander Reyes, I'm in the hangar, preparing to deploy Scout. Elias, I need you to monitor the hull stress factors from command. If the external entity shifts its focus during the launch, we all die. Zara spoke into the comms. Understood, Zara. Be quick. The temperature in the main corridor is spiking. Anya says the organisms are consuming the heat energy from the hull as they grow. They're accelerating. Elias's voice was tight with stress. Zara gripped the controls. The launch sequence was violent. First, the inner hangar door had to seal. Then, the hangar itself was flooded, equalizing the pressure to kilometers depth, a process that involved massive hydraulic pumps and a terrifying influx of sense and psi water pressure. HSS Esh. The water rushed in, coating the ROV. In a torrent of abyssal sludge, the process took a long nerve Jan W racking minute. Scout is live. Outer door opening, Zara announced. The outer hangar door, a circular hatch thicker than a man, rotated slowly. The station groaned, and the floor plates underneath Zara's feet shuddered violently. The external entity had registered the change in structural tension. The pressure exerted on the hull outside Junction D spiked from 570 to 595. Raw. Abort. The stress is too high, Reyes shouted. If I abort now, the external entity learns we are deploying reconnaissance and will focus on the hangar next. We go now, Zara replied. Her eyes locked on the control stick. She nudged the stick forward. Scout slipped out of the hangar and into the black. The first visuals were nothing but inky darkness, disturbed by the ROV's powerful floodlights. Scout descended slightly, then rotated yobaling degrees to face the station's massive, pressure-generated hull. K Fushirsu was a fortress of dull titanium and composite material, but now it looked like a wounded beast. Where the original drill shroud had been, the hull was deeply gouged and shredded, looking like an aluminum can violently ripped open. Zara moved Scout slowly up the hull, aiming for the D-Gen junction section, the area currently under maximum stress. The sonar filter, Zara's custom Jan-designed frequency, suddenly flared, tracing a dense, irregular shape against the background of the abyss. There, the high Jan-powered lights of the ROV pierced the immediate darkness. The sight was not of a monstrous kraken or a glowing, alien vessel. It was something far more psychologically devastating, fused to the hull, centered precisely over the point where the internal biodzan mass was pushing back from the sealed junction D, was an impossible formation. It appeared to be a huge pulsating mass of interlocking silicon-Zan-based crystals, arranged in a dizzying, non-Zan Euclidean geometry that defied the eyes to hold its shape. It looked like a city made of diamond shards, but it was organic, flexing, and undulating with purpose. It was generating the rhythmic thump, thump, Jan thump, not with muscle, but with precise geometric contractions. The internal structure of the crystalline entity was condensing and expanding its mass, focusing millions of tons of pressure onto a single square meter of titanium. Then, Zara saw the details. Thousands of needle, thin filaments, extended from the edges of the mass, adhering to the hull. They weren't just anchored, they were drilling. The fine, high speed chatter she had heard was the sound of these microscopic diamond drills rotating against the titanium grain, eroding the hull bit by bit, creating new microscopic points of ingress for its internal counterpart. Helm record and transmit all visual data, Zara breathed, her professional calm finally fracturing into a horrified whisper. Reyes, Elias, it's not an animal, it's an architect. It's building an entrance. It's folding the station in on itself. As she transmitted the data, the external entity reacted to the floodlights. The entire mass shuddered, and the thump increased in frequency, accelerating from 1 beat every 3 seconds to 2 beats per second. The force spike was immediate and devastating. Hull stress 99%. Initiating structural collapse sequence. Helm screamed. The entire station lurched violently to the side. Zara slammed the throttle, pulling Scout away from the entity. But the image was burned into her mind. The complex, crystalline geometry was not just pressing on the hull. It was beginning to melt the metal through focused, sonic energy, creating a hole in the station large enough for its terrible bulk. This chapter confirms the terrifying intelligence and non-Zan biological nature of the external entity, framing it as a cold, calculating architect, using focused pressure and micro-Jan drills to penetrate the station. The horrifying feed from the ROVEV, the image of the architect's crystalline geometry pressing against the hull and beginning to melt the titanium, had been cut short by the 99% structural stress alarm. The video file, however, remained burned into the station's memory and into the minds of the 4 surviving crew members. Hull stress is fluctuating between 99% and 99%, Elias reported, his voice high-Jan pitched and breaking. He was huddled in the command module with Commander Reyes and the shell Jan shocked Dmitri, monitoring the structural integrity readouts. The rhythmic pulse is now continuous, Commander. It's not counting anymore. It's holding. Reyes pounded his fist on the console. It knows we're trying to move. It's pinning us. He grabbed Dmitri by the shoulder, his eyes hard and uncompromising. Volkov, you and Zara are the only ones who can do this. The mobile drive is the only way up, but the safety protocols will never clear the 99% tress reading. You have to manually override the core. Injection sequence in the engine bay. The engine bay, E-Jan bay, was a massive isolated module on the far side of the central junction, requiring a transit of 50 meters of pressurized corridor. A corridor now crisscrossed by air ducts carrying the spreading compound X. I can't go back out there, Dmitri stammered, his eyes darting toward the blast door of Junction D where his partner Ben had perished minutes before. The mass, it's heavy, Commander. It moves like oil. You are the senior engineer, Dmitri, Reyes said, stripping the panic from his voice and replacing it with pure, cold command authority. Ben died getting that blast door sealed. If you fail now, his death meant nothing. Zara is already in the maintenance hangar. She's waiting for you at the Ejan Bay access hatch. Go, now. Dmitri swallowed hard, nodding once. He took the heavy Jan-duty fire extinguisher Reyes thrust into his hands. It was the only weapon they had against a silicon organism that hated cold. Dmitri met Zara at the maintenance bay's junction. She was detached, almost unnervingly calm, holding the wrench she had grabbed earlier. The hissing from the ventilation grills was louder here, accompanied by a faint metallic odor. The smell of hot, stressed titanium being actively worked on by the exterior architect. The fastest route to the core injectors is through the lower access tunnels, Zara explained, pointing to a narrow-floored Zan-level hatch. We bypass the main corridor, but we go right past the primary HVAC manifold. The biozan mass is densest there. The fire extinguisher only buys us 10 seconds of freeze time max, Dmitri whispered. 10 seconds is enough for a physicist to calculate a trajectory. Dmitri, it has to be enough for a man to run, Zara replied, her words devoid of emotion, yet serving as the sharpest form of motivation. They squeezed through the lower access hatch and plunged into the darkness of the narrow service tunnel. The atmosphere was immediately stale and cold, but as they advanced, the temperature began to climb unnervingly. Anya's earlier assessment was correct. The Compound X was consuming the station's heat to replicate. When they reached the HVAC manifold, the thump, the thumps and thump was no longer a vibration. It was a percussive force. The main duct overhead was pulsing rhythmically. Then they saw it. A dark, gelatinous substance was visibly seeping from the air-jan seal gaskets around the manifold inspection panel. It was the Compound X, having saturated the entire HVAC system, now extruding itself into the tunnel. Go, Dmitri, go. Zara shoved him forward. Dmitri scrambled past the manifold. The black fluid dripped onto his shoulder, instantly adhering. He felt the impossible sudden weight, like 100 tiny, localized gravitational fields, pulling at the spot where the organisms clung. He slammed the base of the fire extinguisher against the affected area, releasing a blast of concentrated C. Oh! The fluid shrieked, a high, Zan-pitched, almost digital sound that scraped across their eardrums and recoiled violently. The organisms hated the cold, but they didn't die. They simply withdrew. They burst out of the tunnel and into the massive high-Zan ceilinged engine bay. The room was dominated by the immense, cylindrical mass of the fission core and the heavy propellant tanks of the mobile drive. Helm, prepare the mobile drive sequence. Zara and I are initiating manual core activation, Dmitri yelled, slamming his hand on the primary control panel. Reyes watched the system status lights flash red in the command module. The whole room was vibrating violently now. The thump from the external architect was a deafening, continuous roar, signaling a desperate fight between the entity's crushing pressure and the failing structural integrity of K. Fushisu. Anya, what is the biozan mass density in the command module ventilation? Reyes asked, his voice strained. Commander, the density is low, but rising rapidly. Anya's voice came over the comms from the med bay. I estimate 4 minutes until saturation. You must seal the module and filter the air on local recirc. We can't seal the module until Dmitri and Zara are back. They won't make it back, Commander, Elias whispered, staring at his console. They're trapped in the engine bay. Look at the pressure readout. The architect is shifting focus to the Ejan Bay Hall section. It knows where the engines are. Reyes looked at the external schematic. Elias was right. The 99.9% reading hadn't disappeared from the D-Gen junction. It had cloned itself onto the Ejan Bay exterior. The architect was now applying simultaneous, focused pressure at two critical, opposing points of the station, intending to shear K Fushisi in half before it could move. In the engine bay, Dmitri threw the final bypass lever. The fission core, designed to hum with quiet, sustained energy, suddenly whined like a captured banshee. The propellant pumps began to violently cycle. Core activation complete. Stand by for launch, Sarah shouted over the mechanical cacophony. Hold, Reyes to Ejan Bay. The architect is squeezing the engine bay. You have seconds. Engage the propellant vent now. Hit it with the external cold burst. The vent is only for thermal regulation, Commander. We'll lose all thrust. Dmitri protested. It doesn't matter. That thing is trying to pin us. It's focused on the heat signature of the core. Hit the propellant vent now. Zara didn't hesitate. She rerouted the massive coolant line that normally circulated around the propellant tanks and violently vented the entire payload of supercooled liquid methane directly against the outer hull section adjacent to the core. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. Outside, where the crystalline geometry was focusing its terrible pressure, a vast cloud of frigid vapor erupted. The external entity screamed, a silent, seismic shriek that registered as a massive spike across every hydrophone. The 99.9小时 UL stress reading in the Ejan Bay instantly dropped to 40%. It worked. It retreated. Dmitri gasped. Helm, engage mobile drive and ascent sequence. Full thrust, Reyes screamed. The station's massive, twin thrust nozzles fired with an explosive roar. K Fushisi was ripped from the seabed. The ascent was not the smooth, controlled rise they had trained for. It was a violent bucking trauma. Screaming metal and the sound of tearing composites filled the station. The G-10 forces slammed the crew into the deck, and then the internal pressure from the ascent created the final fatal crack. From the engine bay ceiling, just above Dmitri and Zara, a massive hydraulic pipe, weakened by the sonic stress, burst. It wasn't water that sprayed out, but a jet of highly pressurized, thick black fluid. The compound X traveling through the pipes, not the vents, its crystalline structures condensed into a high Jan pressure stream. It hit Zara first. She didn't scream. The heavy mass slammed her against the wall, covering her torso and pinning her like a fly under liquid lead. Dmitri, still holding the extinguisher, saw his fate mirrored in his partner's horrified, analytical eyes. He had a choice: save himself or save the ascent. Reyes, mobile drive is active, but the E-Gen Bay is compromised. I'm sealing it. Tell Elias to monitor the structural readouts. And the massive, flowing black mass, now focused, surged toward Dmitri. He didn't wait. He slammed his hand on the emergency E-Gen Bay lockdown seal, isolating the engine bay from the rest of the station, knowing he was locking himself and Zara in with the thing. The last sound Reyes heard over the comms was the desperate, metallic clack of the E-Gen Bay door sealing, followed by a final, synthesized whisper from Helm. Structural integrity in the D-Gen junction area has failed. Water ingress confirmed. Section B is collapsing. The station's ascent was less a climb and more a controlled explosion. The powerful thrust of the mobile drive, coupled with the violent shearing of the D-Gen junction section, spun K Fushisi like a coin. Commander Reyes, thrown against the console by the G-Gen forces, felt the metal groan and shriek around him. The final death rattle of 2 crew members and the majority of the station's structural integrity. Structural integrity in the D-Gen junction area has failed. Water ingress confirmed. Section B is collapsing. Helm's voice was calm, a digital insult to the reality of the crisis. Anya Petrova, having braced herself against the bulkhead of the command module, moved first. She didn't look at Reyes, who was struggling to pull himself off the depth. She didn't look at Elias, who was staring blankly at the ruined consoles. She looked only at the digital schematic of the station flashing urgently on the main screen. Red, Elias, command module lockdown, local recirculation only. Reyes, the central airlock, Anya shouted, grabbing 2 emergency sealant patches, heavy resin jan-backed polymer sheets designed for temporary hull breaches. The pressure wave from the ascent tour section, B's blast door seals. If that module floods completely, the surge will implode the central junction. Elias, galvanized by her direct instruction, slammed the local recirculation switch. The command module hissed as its internal pressure spiked slightly, sealing them off from the rest of the ship. Reyes finally found his voice, raw and gravelly. I need telemetry, Elias. What's our depth? Is the architect still following? Elias slammed his hand down on the sensor panel. Depth is increasing rapidly. We're at geodernal kilometers and rising. But, Commander, look at the external tracking data. The external visualization showed K Fushusi Futa violently ascending, but slightly below them, a persistent, large green signal. The architect's crystalline geometry was maintaining a perfectly synchronized distance. It was no longer applying crushing force. It was matching their velocity, clinging to the pressure envelope created by the station's ascent. The rhythmic brum was still there, but now it was a low, powerful thrumming vibrating through the escaping structure. It's not just following us, Commander. It's hurting us, Elias whispered, his terror compounded by the chilling logic of the entity. It allowed the ascent to commence because it knew the velocity change would compromise the station's weak points. It's waiting for the water to flush the remaining personnel to one central location. Anya didn't wait for a strategic debate. She grabbed an oxygen tank and sprinted out of the command module, her white medic uniform stained with oil and fear. The central junction was chaos. The heavy steel floor was buckled, and steam hissed violently from ruptured pipes. The blast door leading to Section B was failing. Water-cold, black, crushing abyssal water was jetting through the seal, atomizing into a freezing spray that instantly dropped the temperature in the junction to near Jan 0. The force of the breach was tremendous, like 1,000 fire hoses aimed at the door. If the internal door failed completely, the entire central segment would be lost in seconds. Anya knew the door could only be sealed manually. The hydraulics were failing due to water contamination. She had to reach the hand Jan crank override, located right next to the failing seal. Helm, reroute emergency power to the central junction lighting. I can't see the crank, Anya yelled into her headset. The weak red strobes intensified, illuminating the horrific scene. The junction floor was slick with freezing water, and the jet of water from Section B was widening the breach, turning the titanium door frame into shredded ribbons. She lunged for the crank, slipping on the metal deck, and slammed into the wall. As she pulled herself up, she saw something move against the jet stream. The Compound X, the black, silicon biogen mass, was flowing against the current of the abyssal water. It was clinging to the wall, a thick, viscous rope of crystalline life, moving with deliberate slowness toward the pressurized jet of water. It was not being washed away. It was climbing the wall, seeking high ground, demonstrating an impossible intelligence in its movement. The Compound X reached the ventilation intake right next to the failing door. The rhythmic thump, thump, dent, thump, started up again, now amplified by the metallic resonance of the junction. The crystalline organism was replicating rapidly, using the heat from the exposed wires and the stress from the failing hull to grow. Anya knew she was being flanked. The flood was coming from the right. The Compound X was coming from the left. She reached the hand Gan crank and began turning it with frantic, desperate energy. The mechanism groaned in agony, resisting the kilometers of ocean pressure that was tearing the door apart. Elias, I need cover now. In the command module, Elias saw Anya's position on the schematic. He knew she had seconds. Reyes was trying to bring the ascent under control, wrestling with the unresponsive stabilizers. I can't leave the console, Elias. You have to help her. Reyes barked, his eyes fixed on the ascent angle, which was violently unstable. Elias, the theoretical physicist who specialized in deep sea acoustics, had never handled a weapon or fought a physical threat. He looked around the command module. All that was left was a spare heavy duty, fire extinguisher, and the 2 remaining sealant patches. He grabbed the extinguisher, ripped off the security tag, and bolted into the central junction. He found Anya straining against the crank, her muscles trembling, the blast door moving millimeter by millimeter. The water jet was now the size of a man's torso, roaring deafeningly. Next to her, the black compound X had condensed into a thick, pulsing mass against the wall, its internal thump vibrating the air. Elias pointed the extinguisher at the crystalline mass. The cold blast shrieked and forced the black fluid to recoil, buying Anya precious seconds. Keep turning, Anya. I can't keep this up. Elias screamed over the roar of the water and the rising thump of the retreating, but not defeated, organism. Anya gave a final, agonizing heave on the crank. The door slammed shut with a sickening final crunch, followed by the heavy clack of the hydraulic locks engaging. The roar of the water stopped, replaced by a terrible, sustained high-pitched whistle as the door sealed, narrowly holding back the ocean. Anya collapsed, gasping, but immediately looked at the console. How long until we reach the Wuzhen kilometer mark? At this rate, less than 2 hours, Elias managed, his hand shaking, the extinguisher now empty. Reyes's voice was grim over the comms. We're clear of the Dijan junction collapse, but the ascent is completely unstable. We're losing control. And Elias, I just ran a cross-Jan section of the external telemetry. The architect is not just following us, it's replicating. There are now 3 distinct mass signatures tracking K. Fuchs's ascent. The architect hadn't just matched their speed, it had multiplied. 3 immense, crystalline entities were now climbing the abyssal trench with them, ensuring that if one failed to stop K. Fuchs, the others would succeed. They had escaped the deepest part of the trench, only to enter a terrifying race against the cloning intelligence of the abyss. That chapter successfully seals the flood, but introduces the horrific new realization that the architect is replicating and hunting them in triplicate. The climb is now a full Jan-blown chase. Elias Thorne, the deep Jan sea acoustician and physicist, was supposed to be the most resilient mind on K. Fuchs. He specialized in the void, the study of phenomena too vast, too slow, or too deep for human sensation. But the sudden, crystalline realization that the architect was not one predator, but 3 distinct masses replicating its perfect geometry, shattered the framework of his scientific sanity. He sat hunched over the damaged console in the command module, the continuous, low Jan frequency brum of the triplicate pursuers vibrating the teeth in his skull. Reyes, grim Jan-faced, was still wrestling with the thrusters, fighting the station's violent list, and Anya was patching a small secondary breach near the med bay with one of the remaining sealant patches. It's not possible, Elias murmured, running the analysis again. Replication requires a high Jan energy, nutrient Jan-rich process. This thing is in the middle of the deep Jan sea abyss, climbing at whoosh kilometers per hour. Where is it getting the mass? Where is it getting the energy? Reyes's voice was sharp. Thorne, stop with the philosophy. Can you predict its move? Are they surrounding us? They don't need to surround us, Commander, Elias replied, tapping furiously at the screen, pulling up the visual data Zara had captured just before her death. The image of the crystalline entity, a pulsing, fractal mass, filled the screen. Look at the geometry of this thing, Elias said, his voice taking on the detached, frantic energy of an academic giving the lecture of his life. It is not a solid. It is an algorithm made manifest. The rhythmic pulse, the thump, 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 and thump, is a function of focused Jan mass displacement. It is controlling the gravitational field immediately surrounding its crystalline structure. He pointed to the seismic chart. When Dmitri and Zara vented the cold propellant, the mass signature of the architect instantly receded, not because it was hurt, but because the sudden cold changed the physical constants around the station. It disrupted the localized pressure field it was generating. So it hates the cold. We knew that, Reyes said, impatient.